A minefield or a ray of hope for us, a crash test for Europe, or a failure for Putin? What pieces will Trump play on the geopolitical chessboard? I, Irina Uzlova, will ask the questions. Pavlo Klimkin, a diplomat and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine in 2014-2019. And co-founder of the Center for National Resilience and Development. Pavlo, I sincerely congratulate you. Congratulations. Thank you for your time. The Economist writes as if he can read minds, claiming that President Biden's cautious escalation of American aid to Ukraine has exhausted Kyiv. They write that Donald Trump's election victory has turned from a nightmare into a ray of hope for the Ukrainian leadership. We look forward to an era of strong states under President Trump's decisive leadership, Zelensky wrote. You say in interviews with my colleagues, including Radio New Voice and others, that we will actually see zero geopolitics, new steps by Trump and others, and the war of attrition will definitely not be his story anymore. How different will Trump's tactics and strategy be in this regard? To begin with, I'm afraid that no one will give you an honest answer right now. I'm afraid that even Trump himself, if you ask him and invite him to an interview on the 24th, he will certainly say a lot of interesting things. But what he says will not necessarily be his policy. Trump, as one of my good Republican friends says, is actually a person who is both rational and irrational. That is, on the one hand, he will of course have his own strategy, including for Ukraine, and on the other hand, it will take some time for him and his team to arrive at this strategy. But if it doesn't work at some point, it doesn't mean that he won't switch and start working according to a different logic, a different strategy. And that's what Trump is about as well. One of the most powerful representatives of the Trump team, the former national security advisor, actually the last one, when we were at home, Mr. O'Brien even says that such unpredictability is Trump's strength. So you and I cannot predict, as we have not predicted now, Trump's new strategy towards Ukraine. Whether this strategy will be like Biden's, we will help you for as long as you need. But this means not in the way you want and need, but in the way our partners can give weapons, financial assistance, and everything else. This is definitely not Trump's logic. Trump likes large-scale steps. Trump likes steps that everyone understands, that are visible, that he represents, and that are perceived by the world as spectacular. Keep in mind that for Trump, even from the point of view of the American Constitution, this is his last term. Nothing will hold him back. That is his place in politics, his political career. His success is an absolutely critical story. He can't afford to tell strategic stories for the next 8, 12, 16 years. It's definitely not Trump. So I think we will see pressure first. Pressure actually on us and on Russia to achieve de-escalation. Trump has promised this many times, including at rallies. Of course, 24 hours is a certain formula compared to his political line, but nevertheless, he will try it. It also does not mean that he will work to get some concessions. There may be compromises, And he will probably demand these compromises, but he will demand them out of what will be seen later as our weakness and his weakness. I don't think it's Trump either. All the plans that we are seeing in various, media outlets are, in my opinion, something very rough, not something that Trump will end up pursuing. So we will see the real Trump closer to the inauguration. Donald Tusk, the head of the Polish government, agrees with us that Trump's unpredictable presidency will be truly dynamic. As well as one of the previous secretaries general, that Trump's unpredictability could be, if not the key to victory, then to potentially some radical changes. And you have already mentioned, Mr. Pavlo, the Trump team. Yes, as it will also depend on who he surrounds himself with. Who will be the people who will advise him and make decisions? John Herbst, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, says there are two camps around Trump. One understands the Ukraine-Russia threat to U.S. security and will follow a Reagan-like policy, as President Zelensky mentioned. The other is focused on threats from Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. What kind of team will Trump form, with new or old faces, and what can we expect from this? John is a person who understands the situation among Republicans very well, but I think the threat of China is really underestimated, maybe by someone in Trump's circle, but not many. The same is true of Iran, perhaps. The same is true for Russia, because we saw in the Republican primaries a lot of people who considered cutting off aid to us, and the Republicans, having sympathy and empathy for us, are still not ready to continue this aid because they do not see a way to win. They do not see a strategy for winning. They have repeatedly said this in both the Senate and the Congress. So this strategy, when we communicate with them, is critically important. I don't think there are two such defined camps around Trump. The classic Republicans who are ready to chop everyone up, and those who simply don't fully understand geopolitics. Those who will be engaged in security foreign policy have a good sense of foreign policy, at least, and understand how the world is changing. It is very important for them that we have a logic for what we do and how we do it. It is very important for us to show our added value for the Western world, the issue of values, the issue of protecting Western values, the issue of protecting the West. It's not enough to be rhetorical. People tend to be practical, and we have to show on our fingers what Ukraine is and what it can do for the Western world, and in particular for the United States. But it is important to show why continuing the aid, which is quite expensive and not just accepted by a part of the Republican electorate, is important. Why this aid leads to a strategic result. Why war for the sake of waging it is something that is in our DNA, because this is our Ukraine, and it is above all else for us. This is what we have to explain to the Americans. Some of those who are now elected to the Senate and Congress are people who represent regions where foreign policy is not the first, second, or third priority, but perhaps the eighth. And it is our task to show that foreign policy is really important and it is vital for the states. When the aid package was being debated, many Republicans were skeptical. They often said, Ukraine is important, but how can we take money from fighting illegal migration and send it to Ukraine, especially when our voters, like farmers in Kansas or Tennessee, don't see it the same way? We need to find the right words to reach Republican voters. As difficult as it is for us, we have to explain why Ukraine is important to them, why Ukraine is important to the states, and why Ukraine is a part of the United States allies that actually strengthens American security. It is possible. It is not a kind of mission impossible, but we need to understand it. The second point is to reach out to the American voter, and the second point is to reach out to the community of those who will be engaged in Trump's foreign security policy, which will most likely be people of different backgrounds and different directions. As John said, John Herbst, whom you quoted, the former will be easier to reach, the latter will not be easy. Well, when was it ever easy for us? So I, for one, am not inclined to believe that we are now in a state that is approaching a catastrophe. I said during the campaign that Trump's election was not a disaster, but it will not be easy to negotiate with this administration. It will be inclined to take perhaps decisive, drastic steps. It will be inclined to possibly change the strategy and reassess this strategy. This is another challenge that, as you well know, we have. Trump personally has never been a big fan of all European allies. Some of these allies that he likes, like Viktor Orban, for example, they are specific for us. I'm not saying good or bad, they are really specific. And Europe, according to Trump and his supporters, should play a bigger role in Ukraine and take on much more responsibility. I certainly agree with this with both hands, and Trump will be a kind of stress test for Europe. The only problem is that in Europe, some people are now in a semi-historical mood, even based on the results of my calls, and they are saying, what should we do next? They think that they will somehow get away with raising costs to 2%, but of course they will not break even. And I think it's an interesting story that we can sell to Trump. This is the story that I talk about with those who may be in Trump's circle on foreign policy and security issues. If the United States is not ready to be a security presence in Ukraine today, in the way we need it to be on the way to NATO membership, then let's make sure that the Europeans play a bigger role. But support the Europeans, and if they are not ready, then push them. That's the idea, actually, which is less likely to be well received by many classic Trumpists. That is, Europe should pay more, provide Ukraine with more weapons, and eventually possibly deploy its troops in Ukraine as a moment of transitional security guarantees. I will say this. I am not very fond of transitional security guarantees. You know that for us Ukrainians, it is either a betrayal or a victory or all or nothing. But if we're going to talk about some compromises, the presence of Europeans in Ukraine is a critical story and a very logical one. As I said, it is reaching some of Trump's entourage and we have to work on it. Trump, as a businessman, will emphasize compromises, and Europe must understand this isn't about being left to fend for itself. We should have realized earlier that independence was inevitable. Life often brings tough tests in politics and defense. And right now, it seems Viktor Orban, Hungary's prime minister, is less nervous and hysterical than others, especially considering his close ties with Trump. I am there now as a welcome guest by invitation. By the way, Orban is visiting Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Hungary, and they have already talked about both pressure and compromises. In particular, the president of Ukraine said that some of those present at the European Political Community Summit in Budapest advocated that Ukraine make appropriate concessions, to which Zelensky replied that this would be suicide for the whole of Europe, and of course, unacceptable for Ukraine. And what role can Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban play now, who probably feels like a powerful geopolitical player, both in the Russian-Ukrainian war and in the relationship between Europe and the United States under Trump's second term? I propose, Ms. Irina, to clarify your question. It's probably not very polite to say that he is a journalist, but he may or may not want to play the role of a conservative leader in Europe. He dreams of it, and he wants to play the role of someone who is a kind of super leader of future conservative values in Europe with the support of Trump. But at least he wants to play the role of a kind of mediator with Trump. And to tell everyone, you see, Trump loves me. He mentioned me even during the debate. He said how great Orban is. He didn't mention anyone else. But he mentioned me. I go to Trump's house. Of course, I don't open the door with my feet. But in general, he is a friend. And now Orban will sell himself in a good way. Of course, and sell his good relations with Trump. I think he will sell these relations quite effectively. Yeah, we know very well that even before the election, many Europeans were talking to Orban about contacts with Trump, and now it will be even more so. Some people were very cautious about going to Hungary during its presidency of the European Union, which is actually a position that doesn't get you much in today's European Union. But today, Orban is definitely a full house. Almost everyone who could has definitely come, and they are talking about the American elections, only about Trump and what position Europe will take. In Europe, there are other right-wing leaders who are respected, such as Giorgia Meloni, to whom Trump and Trump's entourage have a very positive attitude. But I think that Viktor Orban still has a chance to be unique, and we'll see if he plays this story. Orban says, I can talk to everyone here. I can talk to Trump, I can talk to Xi, I can talk to Putin, I can talk to Zelensky, I can talk to Brussels, and I can talk to myself, and that's why I'm unique. Let's work with me. And I don't rule out that Orban will try to organize something like a peace summit in his Budapest. It will definitely not be Minsk. Minsk bye-bye. I don't feel any special empathy for Lukashenko in Trump's environment, but I do feel for Orban. So Budapest may be the place of some future peaceful events. Peaceful, not necessarily in the literal sense, as you understand, but peaceful in quotation marks, whether we want to participate and under what conditions. This is a story that probably goes beyond the scope of our conversation today, but Orban and Budapest have a chance. This is what I want to say. Trump can come to Budapest, and Budapest, at least at some stage, can play a mediating role. I don't want to say mediating. You understand that mediating is something else. And maybe in some things, Orban has already failed. You remember that he went to Tbilisi after the election, and the fact that he failed there does not mean that he will not try again with even higher stakes. Orban has been preparing for Trump's rise to power for years. And even between Orban's entourage and Trump, there are some fairly stable ties, both political and ideological. So I pay tribute to Viktor Orban, and I pay tribute to the opportunity for him and Budapest to play a certain mediating role is a reality. And on this mediation platform, on this potential negotiation platform, it could be, well, purely, I understand that it is impossible to predict now, but Trump could come up with such a war freeze. Or when he realizes that this is not really what he wanted, then this mediation platform will not matter. You and I, Miss Irina, cannot say now what this platform will be like, whether Orban will want to gather representatives of the non-Western world, whether he will want to start a kind of contact group there, conditionally with the Chinese, and call everyone and say, everyone, now that Trump is my friend, let's do something. Let's come to Budapest. You've already come. I'm still ready. The catering is there. The place is there. I'm here. I mean, this is a serious story. I'm joking, of course. But Orban has a chance. What he can do, whether he can create some kind of mediation format, whether he can host some kind of conference that he will call a peace conference, or some kind of conference with representatives, whether some kind of non-public negotiations can take place there in Budapest before the public ones. All of this is possible. But it's hard to say what it will look like as of today because there is a lot of speculation. But I think in a few weeks, these speculations will be somewhat clarified. Well, and Orban, who we all remember his so-called peace tour when he traveled to all countries in the summer of 2024, who could be involved in a potential negotiation process in Hungary itself directly. So he is not giving up. He sees the goal. He sees no obstacles. And how long, Pavel, has Xi Jinping been preparing for the stunning comeback, as the Western media write, to Trump's return to power, and what Trump will do with Xi Jinping now? I think everyone understands perfectly well that Trump wants to impose new duties and tariffs on Chinese goods, which would mean changing the rules in the U.S.-China trade relationship. A significant number of Trump's classic voters are keen to see Chinese goods subject to higher duties and tariffs and are also keen to see manufacturing in the United States. This is constantly being talked about. This is a serious issue within the Republican Party. Losing some American markets will make European markets more important to China, which will push Europeans to take on a separate geopolitical role. Trump will guide Europeans to support his approach to China. So Europe is also facing a difficult period, where, in fact, I think Trump may impose certain duties and tariffs on European goods, as he has already done. So this story is also absolutely real, and we can enter the world
Тобто ця історія також абсолютно реальна, і ми можемо вступити в світ, де
where restrictions on trade will become not just real, but commonplace.
чимось абсолютно не просто реальним, а буденним.
We are going to live in a world that is different from the one we used to live in during the so-called globalization. And we also need to understand what China's strategy will be in the coming years.
І ми також маємо зрозуміти, якою стратегією для Китаю послуговуватиметься Сі Цзіньпін.
Will he put additional pressure on Taiwan? Trump, as you know, has repeatedly said why we have to protect Taiwan and why Taiwan has become important in chip manufacturing. So his attitude toward Taiwan is not as clear-cut as many in the Democratic administration. Will he negotiate?
Тобто його ставлення до Тайваню не є таким однозначним, як у багатьох в демократичній адміністрації. Чи буде він
Will it go to conflict with the Chinese? Could there be some kind of agreement on Taiwan that would counterbalance the introduction of additional tariffs?
своєрідною противагою на запровадження
It's hard to say. There is also the factor of North Korea, which has consistently helped the Russian regime and already has its own soldiers. And this is a very difficult challenge for the Trump administration. They are well aware that Japan, South Korea, and the Pacific Ocean are important to the United States.
для адміністрації Трампа. Вони прекрасно розуміють, що інтереси в Японії, інтереси в Південній Кореї, інтереси взагалі в акваторії.
Do you remember when Trump met with Kim Jong-un to no avail? Will he meet again? We'll see, but I think he's made his conclusions. Although I do not rule out that after some preparation, Trump will try to meet with Xi Jinping to discuss the new logic of U.S.-China relations.
Він зробив. Хоча я не виключаю, що він на це піде. Я не виключаю, що після певної підготовки Трамп спробує зустрітися з Сі Цзіньпіном для того, щоб обговорити.
As we have said, some kind of meeting may take place at other venues, such as summits or in Budapest, if this logic continues. That is, in my opinion, U.S.-China relations are a marker by which we will determine how geopolitics and geoeconomics will develop in the coming years.
Ця логіка буде продовжена. Тобто, як на мене, американсько-китайські відносини – це той своєрідний маркер, за яким ми будемо визначати, як
And I think it's a very interesting question for Xi right now, whether he's ready to raise the stakes on Taiwan. And if you want my personal opinion, I think he is. We will see what this means for security and for the East Asian region in the near future.
Я вважаю, що готовий. Що це буде означати для безпеки і взагалі в регіоні Східної Азії, ми подивимося найближчим часом. Тільки не зрозумійте мене
But
невірно.
don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the Chinese will start landing on Taiwan tomorrow or the day after, but they may impose, for example, a partial blockade or a no-fly zone or a combination of these. And that would be a significant raising of the stakes. We will quickly see how this will affect global production, given that Taiwan's TSMC is still the leader in the chip market.
І враховуючи, що тайванська компанія TSMC досі є
But I think we are going to see a lot of non-trivial twists and turns. As I say to some of my Western friends, 3 years ago, I asked them if they could theoretically imagine that Ukrainian and North Korean troops could be within striking distance of each other in the Kursk region.
От 3 роки тому я їх питаю, ви могли собі теоретично навіть уявити, що українські війська і північно-корейські війська можуть
3 years ago, this question would have seemed absurd, but now it's a reality. The world we live in shows that what seems impossible today can happen tomorrow or next month. Ukraine should not dismiss options that seem impossible now in its strategic and tactical planning.
Тому світ, в якому ми з вами живемо, означає, що те, що не відбувається сьогодні, може відбутися завтра або післязавтра. І не за 20 років, а за рік.
A year or 6 months, that is, there is nothing that is really impossible. And I believe that Ukraine, in its strategic and tactical planning, should not reject options that seem impossible today. That is, everything is possible. And the classic war of attrition, well, our war is not a classic war, but it is still a war of attrition.
Тобто все можливо. І класична війна на виснаження, наша війна не є класичною, але все одно це війна на виснаження.
Anything is possible. The classic war of attrition is not a classic war, but it is still a war that is not optimal for us, given the difference in our potential and the potential of the Russian regime. There is help from our allies and partners, but still, a war of attrition is not the best option for us. And it is with Trump that we can discuss non-trivial options.
І от якраз з Трампом ми можемо говорити про нетривіальні опції, і він може...
He may be more loyal to such options. And I think when we talk to him, on the one hand, it should be a well-thought-out strategy because he is a businessman. But on the other hand, it will include creative options that we can do together with the Americans. And we should not hesitate to offer such options.
Такі креативні опції, які ми можемо здійснити разом з американцями. І ми не маємо хизуватися такі опції пропонувати.
Trump has already discussed the issue of North Korean troops involved in the Russian-Ukrainian war with the president of South Korea, to whom he also has an ambivalent attitude. This is also about money, as they'll have to pay more for American contingents. We don't know the details, but we expected a response from the U.S. beyond concern. South Korea may offer help, but European partners will likely react after the U.S. elections. The election process is ongoing, but a response will come. What do you associate with its actual zero apart from the electoral processes? Two armies, two nuclear powers are fighting against us on the European continent, and we are only reacting, discussing everything. We have to understand that this reaction does not have to be public, and part of it may be non-public.
Ця реакція не обов'язково бути публічною і є публічною. Частина цієї реакції може бути не публічною і слава
Thank God if this is the case. Similarly, our cooperation with South Korea should be strategic.
бути стратегічною.
Some people would like to see South Korea make a decision as of yesterday to start supplying airborne weapons, such as helicopters, tanks, something like that.
Танки, щось таке.
This is not an easy decision for South Korea, by the way, but I wish it would come true and be realized.
При всьому моєму бажанні, щоб це справдилося і здійснилося.
I would really like to see the South Koreans, come to the point where they can produce not only in South Korea, but also here in Ukraine, transfer some technologies to us, start using our capacities, our creativity, our experience in matters such as drones, the use of artificial intelligence for drones, and so on, so that this cooperation is worthwhile.
Використання штучного інтелекту для дронів і так далі. Тобто, щоб ця співпраця мала сьогоднішній вимір і вимір майбутнього.
By the way, I think that the Americans would be interested in such cooperation because they have these military-industrial clusters, which are located in the States, of course, but they cannot place everything in the States. It simply does not work that way in South Korea.
Кореї, щоб воно працювало в нас. І вони прекрасно розуміють, що одна справа це Німеччина, де там маса політичних рішень, і знову там коаліція сипеться.
For it to work in our country, and they are well aware that it is one thing to have a lot of political decisions in Germany, where the coalition is falling apart again, and there is again a threat of a confidence vote and most likely early elections.
І для неї ВПК абсолютно критична історія. Так що от з Південною Кореєю деякі моменти, вони не мають бути обов'язково публічними. А другий момент, так, така
Ukraine is in an unconventional war with Russia, where the military-industrial complex is crucial. With South Korea, some things should stay private. It's important that any response is not limited to semi-formal sanctions, as the sanctions on North Korea and Russia have failed.
Росії. Це не значить, що він не працює. І оскільки він здорожчає і для Північної Кореї, і для Росії постачання критичних компонентів ускладнює. Тобто це хороша історія.
That doesn't mean it doesn't work. And because it's more expensive for both North Korea and Russia, It makes it harder to supply critical components. So it's a good story. But it's a good story. It's a glass half empty, not half full. As Ukrainians, we hope for near-complete, effective solutions, though full ones are rare in geopolitics. The lessons the West has learned from North Korea and Russia are invaluable, from which we need to draw conclusions and apply new approaches for both North Korea and Russia. And if the states are the leader in this story, I think it will be very cool, but it can't really be launched in a week or two. But at least I would like it to last for years. About the Kremlin. Peskov answers something incomprehensible, the spokesman for dictator Putin. Their expectations for Trump's presidency haven't been met, and they're confused. Do you think Russia's hopes will be dashed, or is it too early to tell? I don't think there's any confusion in the Kremlin, Miss Irina. I would love to say that there is, but I don't think so. I think they were preparing for the Trump presidency. They know Trump very well. They always study all the psychological subtleties and nuances. They also understand who his team members might be. They also understand that his strength is unpredictability and willingness to take drastic steps. They also remember that, although limited, he can raise rates, for example, on the supply of javelins, which happened during the Trump administration. And there are many other things. If Trump feels that something is not working out, he can very quickly raise the stakes, unlike anyone else, and unlike the Europeans. So I think that Trump's victory for the Kremlin is rather a sweet and bitter taste of a meal where they don't know how long this meal will last, whether it will last at all, what else will be served. When you sit down at the table and don't understand what the menu is, they tell you, this is a surprise. Who you will be having dinner with is also not fully known, because it is not known who will be in Trump's team and who will provide real drive. It is also unknown how the partnership with Europe will develop, and this is a weak point for the West. For me, it would be a geopolitical dream that under Trump, relations between Europe and the United States would not only not deteriorate, but at least be preserved. I say not deteriorated, but strengthened. Many of my European friends consider this almost impossible and say, Pavel, what are you talking about? Again, some moments that are almost impossible. But I believe that everything is possible. This requires creative thinking. It requires going up not to the height of a helicopter, but to the height of an airplane or satellite, and seeing why the West is now concerned with solidarity as a matter of survival, against the backdrop of a new quality of relations between Russia, Iran, North Korea, China, and so on. And if this kind of thinking prevails in Washington, in key European capitals and in key Asian capitals that belong to the West, it could produce a very interesting result. Whether this will happen, I cannot predict today. I'm not in the business of predicting the future. I don't do tarot cards and so on. I'm a geopolitics and geoeconomics major, but I think this possibility cannot be ruled out. It is real. And we cannot say under what conditions it will happen, because we will be very good with black swans. This is my intuition and understanding of the current state of the reset of the global security architecture. And democratically, this is the case when we need to look up and down from airplanes and helicopters to realize the threats. Russia is not a chak-chak in a cauldron, and it will have to eat it. And whether it is a bitter or sweet dish, whatever it is, it will stand in their way. Mr. Klimkin, thank you very much for this wonderful conversation. Thank you for the accents. We thank you. Have a good evening. Take care. See you soon. Pavlo Klimkin was with us, dear friends, a diplomat, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine in 2014-2019. And co-founder of the Center for National Resilience and Development. Please leave your comments, assessments, and analysis. I am sure you have something to say after listening to our conversation, after listening to our other interviews. Please like this interview if you liked it and subscribe to YouTube on the 24th. Take care. Believe in the armed forces of Ukraine.